And thanks a lot for accepting our invitation and coming.
The honor is all mine. Thank you. So, I'm actually a little nervous. I've given this talk a lot, different forms of it, to different audiences. It's only the third time I've actually given it to students. So you're going to have to help me out on this because I'm used to sort of that common vernacular of a lot of the regulatory environment, the clinical trial works, the payer environment. And so if I use acronyms that you don't understand or a concept that doesn't make sense, raise your hand. Plenty of time, hopefully, at the end for deeper questions. But if something doesn't make sense, stop me, because in all likelihood, it doesn't make sense to most of the folks in the room. So please do that and stop me. So I'll talk a little bit more about HealthCore at the end, and because I think it is relevant to some of the discussions and stuff that I'll go through here today. But I'm going to spend the majority of my time talking about something that I think is really underappreciated in healthcare, and it sort of starts with this. It's undeniable that the healthcare system is an absolute mess. It's unsustainable costs, the variations in quality are enormous, and the lack of care coordination is really a big symptom of the highly fragmented system we live in. And there's billions of dollars that go into the fixing of these numerous problems that are in healthcare. You've got a tremendous amount of work being put into new payment models in the healthcare system, tremendous amount of work being put into genomics research, a tremendous amount of work that goes in, an investment that goes into system consolidation. You have hospitals buying hospitals, and hospitals buying practices, and payers buying providers. But the reality is, of all those issues and all those solutions, even looking at Obamacare versus Trump care, none of those will work. None of them will work. Because if you peel back the complexities of the healthcare system, you start looking at the issues down, there's an issue at the core of healthcare that if we don't fix that issue, then none of the other solutions will work. I just noticed there's a Clemson jersey in the back right there. I saw you when you walked in. I was going to call you out earlier, but I thought you left. So the no cheering. So the issue, though, if we start thinking about the solutions, and I'll get to what that issue is. I'm going to peel back pieces of this. But if we're going to solve this problem, it's hard to argue that the starting point is not here. If you think about, of all the relationships in healthcare, the one by far that's the most important is this relationship, and the decisions made by the two. And everything that we do in healthcare, regardless of what aspect of healthcare we're in, has to go toward improving the decisions made between those two individuals. Because if we don't, the reality is that everything that comes after is going to be ineffective. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that. But the reality is those two individuals don't live in a vacuum. So if we're thinking about the decisions that they're making, we have to realize that there's a lot of decisions made before the options actually get to those two individuals for them to make a decision with. So think about this. This morning I spent time with a lot of individuals within the College of Science that I would consider innovators, right? They're those that are making decisions as to where to look. So those innovators could be organizations like the NIH, it could be academic institutions, it could be life sciences companies, and they're trying to decide where to invest their money and their time. And they're trying to think about how to develop specific technologies, whatever that technology might be, whether it's a pharmaceutical, biologic, or a device, or a procedure even. You also look at the regulators who make decisions about what to approve and under what conditions do I approve that. You look at payers and policymakers who make the decision, what do I pay for and under what requirements do I place that reimbursement for healthcare services. Then you get to the provider who decides, what do I prescribe and how do I follow up to that patient, and patients who are trying to make decisions of, do I seek care and do I continue to adhere with the care that's been prescribed to me. Here's where the problem begins. The system begins to fail when you start thinking about the evidentiary requirements that a regulator needs to approve a drug to put it on the market versus the evidentiary requirements of everyone afterward. So all those people who have to make decisions afterward actually need different information to make those decisions than the regulators are asking for. And the problem that creates is that a lot of the downstream consequences are, a lot of the evidence that comes out is irrelevant, and the timing of when relevant evidence is developed is far after the time period when they actually need it. And I'll walk you through some of the consequences of that. So what I mean by that is that the FDA really is trying to determine if something works and if it's safe under ideal circumstances. And I'll dig into that in a little bit more as well. When the product comes onto the market, all those decision makers are afterward are saying, does this product work in the patient sitting in front of me or the population that I'm making reimbursement decisions about? Is it safe now on large scale, not on gross issues of safety, but what about now small issues of safety and tolerance? What about the economic impact? So if the product is a little bit better than the other options available, but it's 10 times more costly, and if I consider healthcare to be a zero-sum game, how do I make those trade-offs? And those decisions are very difficult decisions to make in healthcare. And so the reality is that the difference between those two different evidentiary requirements is tremendous. And there's a big consequence, and I'll explain that to you. So one of the things that, if you think about healthcare, despite the fact that I'm saying that the evidence out there is very poor evidence, and I'll give you the examples of why that's the case, we still publish more than 1 million new pieces of research in the clinical realm every year. So if you look at Medline, which is part of the National Library of Medicine, more than 1 million new citations go on to that very large database every year. And you think about that physician now and that patient, how do they actually ingest all of that and make better decisions? And the reality is they don't. So one of the things that they use, healthcare uses, is they try to use things called therapeutic guidelines. And the guidelines are really a way to sort of pull together all the evidence. So you get a group of experts together looking at a very specific therapeutic condition or specific aspects of a condition, and they just try to make a decision using all the information out there. They fill out, in essence, a decision tree. And that decision tree, they use that to help guide care and help providers and patients make better decisions about what to use under what conditions. So this is a study that was published back in 2009 by Rob Califf. He was the FDA commissioner who just stepped down. He's a cardiologist at Duke, or was a cardiologist at Duke before he went to the FDA. He's now at Google's Verily, and everyone knows what Verily is a healthcare portion of Google. But what Rob did on this, and actually he and his group looked at all the cardiovascular guidelines out there, and of the 16 major guidelines, remember they're decision trees. So within those 16 guidelines, there's 2,700 nodes within those guidelines that says if this, then that, if this, then that. And think about that being applied to a patient decision-making process. So if you're looking at the quality of the evidence within those guidelines, what % of those recommendations, of those 2,700 recommendations, would you suspect were backed by sufficient evidence to warrant the recommendation? A guess?
10%.
Yeah, that's pretty good. 11%. What does that mean? Think about what that really means.
90% have no guess.
That's right. 90% of the time, we don't know what to do. We simply don't know what to do 90% of the time. We think about variations in healthcare. Remember the first slide that 45% of the time physicians don't adhere to the guidelines or recommendations? Well, that may be warranted because the reality is we don't know what to do, and yet we spend so much money trying to get them to adhere to the guidelines. When the patient sends them across them, the evidence may not apply to them. So these are the 16 guidelines. Of all of them, one of them actually scored best, and that's congestive heart failure. And in that case, only 26%. Some of them are 0%. Think about this. Think about how much time and energy, money, decisions are based upon some of these guidelines. The point being is in healthcare, we don't know what to do. So if you think about that as one layer of that onion, peeling back on what we have to fix, that's a real problem. If we don't know what to do, how can we get everyone to do it? So how does this get here? So if we think about how we actually look at any technology, so let's think about it in terms of a drug, right? If we're going to look at a drug, over time, we gradually, once a product enters human testing, we actually gradually expose that product to more and more individuals to try to first and figure out, is it safe? And then, does it work? And we gradually expose it all the way up into the point in time when a product comes onto the market after phase 3, those that make it then go onto the market, and you continue to do research to build that evidence base. But here's the problem. Utilization of that product very, very quickly, immediately outstrips the evidence base, meaning that the patients that are exposed to the product vary tremendously from the patients that actually were studied. And they vary in very meaningful ways. Different age groups, different race, ethnicity, so think about genomics, unstudied comorbid conditions, think about differing concomitant drugs, lifestyle variations, differences in disease severity, differing levels of compliance. Carla and I were talking this morning about, think about the impact of timing of dose. If you study a drug on your specific times when you dose it, then it comes out in the real world and they take it at different times. In some cases, that may make tremendous amount of difference in terms of how a drug works. Yet that's the real world. And all those folks, after the product comes to the market, have to make decisions, do I use it or not? And the reality is they don't know for that person sitting in front of them if it works. So when I started my career, I started as a clinical pharmacist embedded in a group practice with 16 physicians, helping them make better decisions about their patients. And they would come to me with train wreck patients and say, look, Marcus, Mrs. Jones is here. She's had diabetes now for 8 years. She's got new onset hypertension. She's also got some signs of end organ damage. She's got microproteinuria in the urine. What antihypertensive should I use? Think about that. And the answer is, I really don't know. Because the evidence base, when we approved the drug to treat hypertension, excluded diabetic patients because it's a source of confounding in the data, right? You try to get the data as clean as you can, and you try to narrow the number of conditions and and it's important because the intrinsic validity of the studies is critical. But the reality is that under the current system, we don't begin to even look at that until the product comes on the market, and that's a real problem. Especially when the patients now are looking at ads on TV, seeing individuals running through the field of flowers and saying, I want that, because I want to feel like that. So it's a real problem. So think about it even further. And this is actually where I really think we need to go. So if you start peeling it back a little bit more so. In that situation with Mrs. Jones, and we're trying to make a decision as to which antihypertensive drug to use for her, the question is, well, it depends, right? And it depends upon a lot of factors. And what we really refer to those as is we call those phenotypes, meaning how the patient may vary in different combinations of relevant characteristics. And the relevant characteristics vary depending upon the condition or maybe even the intervention at times. But if you think about the relevant characteristics, you say, well, it depends upon all these factors. In some cases we know, in some cases we don't. But if we really want to get to true healthcare, you've heard about the precision medicine initiative, right? Well, it's an aspect of the thinking like that. And the idea is that, well, when we look at studies today in the traditional world of doing research, we think on average the drug lowers blood pressure by this amount. And on average, this percent of patients have this adverse event. And so healthcare decisions, if you consider them always being, but the decisions made between those individuals is always a risk versus benefit decision, then the reality is we know for them is that benefit varies across phenotype. Well, so does adverse events. Has anyone heard of the drug Vioxx? Some folks nodding their head. Vioxx is a drug they used to treat, or they used to be on the market, they treated arthritis. It's in a class of drugs called COX-2 inhibitors. And so it's very different than drugs like ibuprofen and naproxen. It's very much like Celebrex, which is still on the market. But Vioxx was on the market for 5.5 years before we realized it was killing a lot of people. In fact, when we actually looked back and looked at our data with an Anthem, we had 10,000 incremental heart attacks and strokes from patients who got Vioxx versus those who didn't under similar conditions. The reality is, though, when the product came off the market, and they actually eventually did pull it off the market, as you can imagine, my guess is that there was a huge spike in patients with certain phenotypes that looked like this. But there's a lot of patients that the only drug that worked for them was Vioxx. And when it came off the market, not only is it a big issue for Merck, who owned the product, who not only lost the revenue from the product and had those lawsuits that came afterward, there's a lot of patients, more importantly, that's all that worked, and now they're out there without a...
But that doesn't go back to the design of the phase 3 or whatever clinical trial. I mean, it's like that means that they haven't included enough
That's right.
individuals that shows different phenotypes.
It's exactly right. So it's not a fault of the trial itself. It's the system and the way we generate the evidence. So that's actually exactly right, Carla. So it's not really a problem with the design of the study. In fact, one of the things that we actually saw from the clinical trials was we were seeing some blood pressures creeping up on those patients. And interestingly, we were advising at that time, and I'll talk about the difference between WellPoint and Anthem at the end, but WellPoint was a large conglomerate of Blue Cross Blue Shield plans that we worked with back in the early 2000s when HealthCore was an independent organization. Anthem was a separate company at that time period. They eventually merged the two companies together. But WellPoint didn't put Vioxx on the formulary because we were seeing those spikes in the blood pressure, and we said there's something's going on there. And Anthem did eventually put it on because they, like a lot of groups, didn't see the real issue with that. It turns out, just by luck, that in fact that was one of the issues that was underneath there, is that actually was impacting the cardiovascular system in other ways that we really couldn't tell. So they did uncover some things, but the problem is that, as you're suggesting, is that the studies weren't big enough and weren't diverse enough when the product came on the market to really tell us the differences and be able to break it out, something like this, or uncover an issue that was actually there even at that time. So the point being, clinical trials as we do them today can tell us if something works or if it's safe. What it can't tell us in whom it works or in whom it's safe. And that's where we need to get to. So if we think about, again, peeling back the layers and the complexity of the system, that for us is a really big charge on this. So I was at a National Academy of Medicine conference last week, and we had 3 of the last 5 FDA commissioners, including the current FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, there. And one of the things we talked a lot about was, how do we fix this problem? How do we fix this specific issue, and how do we get to this point and trying to help the providers? Because it's not just in cardiovascular disease we have the problem. I pointed out before that in cardiovascular disease it's 11%. In oncology, would you think it'd be better or worse? Think about how much money goes into oncology research. Right? It's 6%. Infectious disease is about 20% of the time, depending on what aspect of infectious disease you're looking at. Diabetes, on paper, at least in the studies, the evaluations that have been done, is a little better, but the reality is I think that's a generous number. Rheumatoid arthritis, about 30%. Opioids, the guidelines for opioids, Rob Califf pointed out last week, are 0. Not a single recommendation in the opioid guidelines is backed by sufficient evidence to warrant the recommendation. It's a serious problem we have. And so let's think about this a little bit more so. So let's go back to this point. How are clinical trials done today? So think about, there's a lot of preclinical testing that goes on, and those products that actually do make it to human testing enter phase 1. And you gradually expose the product to more and more people, initially with healthy individuals, and then you get to individuals with the target condition to see if it's actually making a difference, but you continue to monitor safety, and then you get into the phase 3 and you start looking at the product in larger populations, and then you approve the product, put it on the market, study it some more when you need to, especially if there are post-marketing requirements. But think about what clinical trials, as they're designed to maintain intrinsic validity, there's a number of things that they do to that trial that impacts the ability to generalize that once the product comes on the market. Think about the number of inclusion criteria that actually go into for a patient to be included in a trial. To make it intrinsically valid, the inclusion-exclusion criteria really narrow the populations down so that your variables are few. So that if the product works, you can attribute it to the drug and not to something else that's going on in the patient. It's a really important aspect of this. But the consequence is that you actually wind up with the applicability of the results only to a very narrow population at that point. For cancer drugs, if you think about the inclusion-exclusion criteria, since the mid-1980s, the number of inclusion-exclusion criteria are actually going up significantly in this. So you're getting narrower and narrower and narrower in terms of the applicability of the results when they're done. If you think also about the conditions, one of the things we've always talked about is that because we did clinical trials as a site for 13 years, if a patient was not adherent to the therapy, based upon our assessment, doing pill counts, whatever it might be, you throw the results out. You don't include them in there. When in reality, most patients aren't adherent to the therapy, especially those on chronic meds. We can't throw those results out, right? We have to deal with that. So what does partial compliance, what kind of impact does that have on outcomes of care? You think about also that if they don't adhere to very strict protocols in terms of when they come back, how they're treated, the diagnosis process, those are very narrowly defined. And in real healthcare delivery, patients go through a very different process in terms of how they're evaluated and ultimately managed with this. And then I would also say that the settings in which the research is done is very different from the settings in terms of research where healthcare is delivered. And a large part of that is because it's so onerous to take on a clinical trial. It takes a tremendous infrastructure to do a clinical trial. So most real-world practices that actually do research do one study, and then that's it. They never do another one because it is extremely difficult and time-consuming and resource-consuming to do it. So they can say, well, I've got to do healthcare delivery. I don't have time to do this. So most of the research is done in academic medical centers or dedicated research centers. And that's great. And individuals who continue to get care in those settings, the results is applicable to them. But those who get care outside of the settings is often not. So what I'm saying is it takes 10 years, $2 billion to generate evidence on roughly 7,000 to 10,000 people. And that system is simply not scalable. It goes back to your point, Carla, on this, is that it's not the trial itself that's flawed. It's the system in which we actually are able to generate the volume of evidence. So if we said, well, we really need evidence on 70,000 or 700,000 patients to really begin to break it down, you can't spend that. You would completely crush the drug development process in this system, because you would basically be increasing the cost to $20 or $200 billion per drug. And you simply can't do that.
And I also think, sorry.
Sure.
I also think there is another problem, which is the problem of the recruitment of people for the clinical trials, and also the fact that if that takes longer, increases the length of that time.
Yes.
And there is a demand from the public for new drugs that cure diseases, and the pressure on the FDA to be sure that whatever they approve is actually safe.
Right.
So, I wouldn't like to work on the FDA. I mean, I can imagine how horrible it might be to be right in the middle. Someone asking for new drugs, and at the same time saying, hold on a second, we need more studies.
Exactly. Their timing is a real issue. Then you actually think about when the product doesn't come on the market, then think about it from a payer's perspective. So we do a lot of work to support the evaluation process for new products for payers, especially our parent companies. So they'll say, well, look, we don't know what to do. Can you help us figure out what the best option is? And where should we, if we're going to make a decision on reimbursement, where should we place this new product coming out? And they've got tremendous pressure from the providers and from the membership to actually, and sometimes from the political parties to say, you need to pay for this drug. And they're saying, well, the evidence is not there. What do I do? And if I pay for this, I can't pay for that. And so whether you're a public or a private payer, whether you're for-profit, not-for-profit, the issues are the same, and that they're struggling with that same issue. So the pressure on the system to make decisions earlier. Think about it also. One of the things that the political pressures, and one of the reasons that this current administration put the leadership in at the FDA, and I'm really glad they went with the individual they did, because Scott's got experience in that space and he understands it well and can govern that, but they're pushing for earlier access to products. The political environment is. And I understand why. I truly understand why. But there is a price we pay for that, a huge price. And so enter in a new industry, real-world evidence development, and I'll talk to you the rest of the time about this, sort of where we are and where we're not with real-world evidence. We started HealthCore back in 1996, and we did it specifically because of how much the current system troubled us, and trying to think about ways we could start looking at new ways to generate evidence. We started playing with data that was generated as a byproduct of the healthcare system, whether that's data from the patient's medical record or even claims data that comes from the healthcare system. So the idea behind this is that, well, if we can leverage new types of data, then maybe we can, at least in the post-marketing world, more rapidly provide that evidence or close that evidence gap to help those decision makers make better decisions, because we can generate more relevant evidence, because it may reflect what happens in the real-world setting. So real-world data, by definition, this is actually a white paper we just finished with Duke Margolis. It came out 2 weeks ago that I think was provided as part of the pre-read on this. But the real-world data is actually any of the data like claims data, data from the electronic health record. It can actually even include data from wearables like Fitbits and other types of things that can be utilized or repurposed to help close the evidence gap. And the term repurpose is an important one. We'll come back to that. Real-world evidence is any types of evidence that's derived from those types of data. And that real-world evidence, importantly, most people that actually know anything about real-world evidence think about it as observational data, but the reality is it's not always observational. We can randomize in real-world settings, and that's a big development that the entire infrastructure and the methods around doing things like pragmatic clinical trials is actually a brand new era, brand new part of the industry that many groups like ours are actually putting a lot of energy into trying to understand and master. In fact, we've got 4 pragmatic clinical trials that are underway right now within our environment. So the idea of what we're talking about now is trying to close that gap. We're trying to look at what happens in that setting and more rapidly to provide the information back to whether it's a regulator, whether it's a payer, or whether it's a provider. We're trying to close that gap. In many cases, it's actually back to the life sciences companies themselves. So one of the types of data that's out there that's been used for a long time is claims data. What claims data is every time any of us goes into the healthcare system, if we're covered by an insurer, whether that's a public or private payer, we generate an encounter in that system, and that encounter tells, it provides the condition, the procedures that were delivered. If you get a drug, it tells that you got a drug, when you got it filled, when you got it refilled. It tells about the number of pills you got, the number of days supply. If you go to the hospital, it can tell you why you went to the hospital. So there's a lot of information, sort of serves basically as an index of that patient's exposure to the healthcare system. And there's some things that you can derive just from claims data alone. It has a lot of limitations, but there's some things you can actually look at what's going on with the claims data, especially if you want to look at things like health economics and be able to do comparative health economics, because all the cost data is also in those data. But it has a lot of weaknesses. And there are a lot of groups out there that are trying to harness this. And probably the most progressive, the one that we've been working on for a long time, is the FDA Sentinel Initiative. And really what the FDA Sentinel Initiative was designed to do was mandated by George Bush in 2007 when he signed the FDA Amendment Act to create an active safety surveillance for the United States. And they were going to take all these claims data and put them in a database and actually allow us to quickly pick up signals of safety. What we've actually done with this over time, though, is because there are plenty of signals of safety, what actually has been more of the work that's been done for the last 10 years on this is actually really looking more at trying to validate signals that we have seen. So if we have a question about the safety of a product, this infrastructure that's out there, and it's a federated data model that we utilize for this, will actually work across roughly 150 million individuals in the country to really determine if, in fact, it was real or not. And if it is real, and what populations was the issue there. And that's actually been most of the work that's been done. But there's many types of initiatives that are either being contemplated, like EvGen, which I can talk about if you'd like, or that are underway. They're actually trying to leverage real-world data to generate evidence much faster. And you can imagine every group that's out there doing it. This is actually a big one, obviously with the NIH and the collaboratory work that they're doing. PCORnet, there's a ton of money that is being put into PCORnet. PCORE, which is a patient-centered outcomes research institute, was actually funded under the Affordable Care Act when it came out. So it was a relatively new institution, but it is trying to do things like close that gap we've been talking about, especially in areas that don't really have strong funding support from the life sciences industry. So claims data by itself is very powerful, as I talked about before. And a lot of organizations use claims data to do research, and they draw conclusions from those claims data. But one of the things you have to think about, and this is an example using claims data, but it's true for any type of data that you're repurposing for something other than it was initially intended to do. In this case, what we did this study back in 2006, and what we're trying to find out using claims data alone, that if we could tell if a person had high blood pressure or they didn't. So the positive and negative predictive value of claims data, and saying that if I saw it in the claims data, what combination of different types of data elements in those data tell me that the person actually has hypertension, and if I don't see that, how confident am I that they don't? And it's an important thing to assess, but it's true for any type of condition that's out there, the same type of issue that we talked about. So in this case, we looked at a lot of different combinations. We came up with the best combination of both positive and negative predictive value here, and came up with if you want to know if a person has hypertension or not, that's probably the best combination of codes to use. But here's the problem. Can you point it out before I do? That number. At least a quarter of the patients who actually have it, I don't see. Meaning I'm assuming they don't in the data. So if I'm looking at it as a primary endpoint or a confounding factor, I'm missing that. We used a medical chart as the gold standard. We actually went to the chart and adjudicated that to make sure that that combination did or did not give us the right answer. But, and so in this case, and it's true for diabetes, heart failure, a lot of these common conditions that we're actually using claims data to generate evidence on, it's actually very weak for certain types of conclusions to draw. What I'm getting at in this is that it's really the combination of those different types of data that come from different places that gives us the most power. So claims data is in this little bubble here. When you look at this Venn diagram on here, it gets infinitely more powerful if we actually integrate data from different places. So we need data from the hospital, with the chart data from the hospital, know what goes on inside of that hospital. And we also need data from on the outpatient setting to tell us what's happening when they're getting care from their specialists or primary care doctors. Or we often need to be able to survey the patient, because no matter what, we often don't know what happens until the patient tells us. Or we don't understand patient-reported outcomes like quality of life, patient satisfaction, when they took their drug. And so those are the things that we think really look at this piece here and saying, well, we really need to be able to pull together lots of different types of data on everyone. Sounds great, right? If we could do that, and we could get all that information together on all of us, and have it readily, high quality, readily accessible for doing research, then we can generate evidence pretty quickly in the healthcare system. It goes back to the point, variability in healthcare is not the problem. It's not being able to study the variability that's the problem. This would help fix that, right? Yeah, it would. It would. But here's the problem, right? Outside of Kaiser, Geisinger, Henry Ford, other places like that where they're fully integrated delivery systems, the rest of the 300 million people in the United States live in a highly fragmented, non-integrated system where the players don't like each other at all. And if we need data from those different places to put it all together, then how do you actually defragment that? So this is the part I spoke on last week at National Academy of Medicine, is how do we actually defragment the data view of the individual? So, and I'll give you an example. One of the ways we tried in California that didn't work. And so, and the reality is that if we're going to get them all to play together, we have to find a common ground for each one of those groups. I sat down one time, I was in Delaware. I met with the CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield in Delaware in the morning. And I said, look, here's what we want to do, Tim. We want to pull all the data together in the state of Delaware. We want to integrate all the data together from the payers and the providers to create an integrated view, and then work in a collaborative fashion to field different types of research designs. And here's what the benefit will be to you. Marcus, that's great. Then he looked out the window across the street, and across the street is the big healthcare delivery system in Delaware called Christiana Care. He goes, if there's no way in hell I'm going to let that guy get my data over there. I don't trust him. I'm not sure what he's going to do with it. I'm not doing it. So then I met that afternoon with the CEO of Christiana Care. Same interaction played backwards. Looked out the window and said, there's no way in hell I'm letting that guy get my data. Because they're adversaries at the table, right? They're always negotiating rates. The only time a payer and provider typically have interacted in the past is when they're negotiating the reimbursement rates. And that's a zero-sum game. You win, I lose.
But maybe, sorry to interrupt.
Yes?
Maybe the solution is third party. So they don't give the data each other. They give the data to you or whatever the other company represents, right? And then they are not sharing that data, but they are still pushing forward the idea.
So in California, we created, us, and it's the only state actually where the Blue Cross and the Blue Shield plans are not only separate, but they actually compete in the same geographic areas. So Blue Cross in California is owned by Anthem. Shield is actually a separate entity. So they actually came together and said, look, let's invest in creating that integrated view, but let's do it, let's create, they put $80 million into a public utility that they had they were set on the board for, but they didn't have any, they did not own that utility. And let's build a multi-payer, multi-provider integrated environment. And let's set it up to be able to solve a lot of the problems I showed you in the first slide. Care coordination, so when you go see your physician, that they can see everything that's been happening. When your patient moves from one payer to another, they'll have the history so they can actually do the right types of, set up for research. It was optimized for all those things. What you couldn't do with the data were tightly locked down. It failed miserably. We put all the payers' data in there from California from those two plans. We had other payers wanting to put theirs in, and not a single provider signed up. That's how deep the issues are in the system. So what we've done in California, and CalIndex stands for California Integrated Data Exchange. It was sort of a next generation health information exchange. And the idea was to solve that problem as we architected this thing. And what we've done now is we've actually merged it with another HIE in California called, the new one's called Manifest MedX. And we're in the process of trying to sort of resolve those issues and get everyone at the table to do it, to solve that particular issue. The divisiveness in the system is deep. That's the real point I'm trying to get at, is that until we solve that problem, and then we actually are able to get everyone to put data, because we said, look, let's put the data, let's stop competing on our data. Let's compete on what we do with the data. Let's put the data in a pre-competitive space so that we can actually solve those issues on a much grander scale. But let's do it the right way. And there's certain principles that we said we had to adhere to make that work. One of them we said, well, look, patient privacy is always key, and data security. No matter what, this has to be the number one overarching governing principle. You have to make sure the patient privacy is protected and data security is key. Second piece on this, you have to minimize data misadventuring. And what we mean by that is that of all the things we could do with our data, one of the things we don't do in Anthem is we don't sell our data. It's a great, highly profitable business. A lot of other payers do sell their data in the marketplace, but we don't, because one of the problems I worry about is if we give our data to someone else, it's very easy then for them to misinterpret it. Because there's so many things we do to the data before it actually hits that database that changes how you would interpret it. Different benefit designs, different changes in when we actually pay for something versus another product, different types of care management programs one patient population may have been under and not another, different payment models from the providers that may change how the patients flow through the system. So we know all those things because we sit on the data and we work very closely back with that parent company, but someone else who gets it couldn't. So we had said, well, you have to have, if you put your data in, we have to be able to have a very highly collaborative model for all those folks to work closely together to make that work. And that was what we were really focused on. We want to protect the business interests as a data source. Go back to my conversation with Christiana Care and Blue Cross Blue Shield of Delaware. You have to make sure that the other guy can't use it to their advantage at the negotiating table. You have to make it illegal for that to happen. So that's the consequences are high, that if you do something you shouldn't do with the data. And you have to accelerate our progress through the learning curve of taking data that was meant for something else and using it for evidence development. And what I mean by that is this. If you think about just the old proverbial learning curve on how we actually learn to use new data, obviously clinical trial data, because it's designed for answering questions specific when you design the study, we're way up there on the learning curve with this. Claims data alone, we're pretty far up too. We've been using this for 20, 25 years using claims data. So the issue with any types of data is not so much knowing what you know, but knowing also what you don't know about the data so that you don't draw conclusions from something and being erroneous. You can at least build that assumption into your results. It's not knowing what you don't know is the real problem. And this is where, when we start looking at other data sources like the electronic health record, which is an absolute nightmare to work in because of the variability in that and the what we call semantic interoperability, not making sure that we can actually, what we're reading out of that chart was what the physician meant when they put it in there. And that's a very different thing sometimes for different physicians. They can say the same thing but meant different things. And if we start thinking about what I'm talking about here on integrating the two together, we're way down here. And we have to solve that problem because the key to unlocking that kingdom is right here in this. And so you can't, if you go out and take the data too far from its original source, you're never going to get up this learning curve. So we have to collaborate to do that. So it's a collaborative model that makes it work. It's an ecosystem, a learning health system. We talk about, you probably have heard that term a bit, but that is actually the key, is creating that type of a framework. I'll spend a little bit of time on this because I think really want, so as I talk about using the data and for different types of research, one of the new designs that's come out that I mentioned earlier is this thing called pragmatic clinical trials. And so the idea, one of the things you can help in terms of your getting the noise out of the data, or at least controlling for it, is randomized, right? Most of the times when we thought about doing randomized clinical trials, the strength of the randomized clinical trial is mostly in randomization. There's other strength in there too, but randomization is the most important point on that. The strength of observational studies is that it can reflect what's going on in the real world. But the problem is that there's a lot of bias you can't control for in methods in the data, right? Or confounding you can't control for. So how do you control for, how do you help that? We introduce randomization. So when a patient is going to get a therapy in the real world setting, you randomize them between them. So think about a drug for cholesterol. The patient shows, or go back to my patient I talked about before, the diabetic patient. Marcus, which drug should I use to treat this patient's diabetes? I don't know. Let's randomize between the three that we think are basically where we have clinical equipoise, right? So let's just randomize between those three. And then let's see which one worked better for her. And then the next time, once we know that, the patients that come back in that look like her, we know which one to use. And if you can do that, you can generate the evidence much faster. And that's sort of the idea behind learning systems. And pragmatic clinical trials have a lot of promise, because you can do them in a much more economical fashion, because a lot of the data you're collecting as a natural byproduct of the healthcare system versus through a case report form, which now means you can also take that and go into the real world practices a little bit easier as well. So if you think about the difference between a traditional RCT and a prospective real-world study like a pragmatic clinical trial, the idea is to do it in many more patients in a healthcare system model that's much closer to what they're actually getting care today, but introducing into that randomization. And if you go back to that learning curve and being able to use the data, why it's so important is because the more I can lower this burden here in terms of data collection by using the data that's collected as a natural byproduct, the more I can involve more patients in the study and more practices in the study. Going back to Carly, your point is that we can actually now get more through the system much faster if we can actually recruit much faster. And that makes it a little bit simpler to do. So without going into too much detail on this, there's sort of the differences between them, but between an RCT and a pragmatic trial. There's a lot of big differences in it. What I'm not saying is you don't want to abandon the RCT. That's not the point. The point is that where do you actually look at leveraging a pragmatic clinical trial, either in combination or instead of an RCT when the questions are fit to that purpose. So going back to the model I showed you before, all the work we're doing right now is in the post-approval space, and that's an evolutionary aspect of this. It's a great step forward. But there's a real big problem with that. If we wait till the product comes on the market, then you still have the issue of time. So I was talking to the head of policy within Anthem a few weeks back, and they said, Marcus, we want to use you guys to do more research for us so that we can make better decisions. But here's my problem. I've got 6 months from the time when that product comes to the market when I've got to make a decision. How do we fix that problem? And the answer is, well, you don't. You can't fix it under that system. You simply can't do that. So the timing is really a key part of this. And so there's a lot of legislation trying to drive the regulatory war to look at things differently in the United States. So PDUFA, which is a Prescription Drug User Fee Act, the new version that just came out, it does every 5 years, that it basically mandated the FDA look at the issue of using real-world evidence for regulatory decision making. And then 21st Century Cures, if any of you have heard of that piece of legislation, 21st Century Cures, said the same thing. So one of the things that the FDA has done is they engaged the National Academy of Medicine, and that's what we were doing last week, to actually to put together a series of workshops. The first one actually occurred last week in Washington, where we're actually looking at this very issue. What are the underlying causes of the problem? What are the solutions to that problem, and how do we actually begin to pilot that in the marketplace? And the planning committee is a pretty diverse planning committee. If you look at this, it's academic, there's payers involved in it, there's pharmaceutical industry, the heads of research for 4 of the big pharmaceutical companies, there's health technologies companies that are out there involved in this. So it's a very diverse group, and the FDA, obviously, FDA is very much involved as well in this whole process. So my point being is that everyone's really trying to push toward this. Right? If you want to solve not only the problem of relevant evidence, but sooner, you have to change how we develop drugs. And you have to do it much sooner. You have to evolve the clinical trial process so that you can actually put more patients through the process much faster, much higher volume, at a much lower price point. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. And this is what we're really trying to drive. This is revolutionary, not evolutionary. And so if you ask me what I spend most of my time on in my career, it's actually trying to influence where that goes. So trying to get our parent company, one of the larger payers, to understand that they're in the research business too and have to be in it, help driving this, that they need to ask for and push for more of these types of data when they're making their decisions, that they get done so that they support it both politically and from a business perspective. When you're working we work a lot with regulators and a lot with the industry. We work with all of those groups to really help them try to not only to begin to ask for them, but to evolve the methods and how we actually can do it, and very importantly, the environment in which we do that. So the last thing I'll talk about here is HealthCore. We're a small subsidiary when you think about us the size of Anthem. Anthem has 50,000 employees. We're 220 researchers within that we're located in 4 offices. Our headquarters is Wilmington, Delaware. We were founded in 1996. We were acquired by WellPoint in 2003, and as I mentioned, right after that, Anthem bought WellPoint, which significantly expanded our environment in which we had to do research. One of the things we're really happy about, we just bought New England Research Institute, closed this month. We're in the process of integrating them. There's a tremendously talented group of folks in Watertown, Massachusetts that we are really, really excited about bringing on. Anyone knows John and Sonia McKinley and the group that they built up there, you know just how good those folks are. And the nice thing is they complement our team really, really well, the types of research that they've done, and which is what we do. This is now our combined sort of profile. It's a really quick snapshot of who we are as an organization. If you can think about the types of talent we need, and this is only a touch of it, we have a very heavy clinical bent in our work as well. So we have a lot of individuals who actually came out of the healthcare system. So if they can figure out sort of not only how to interpret the data, but how do you actually get it back into the hands of those decision makers to make good decisions. Our client base is pretty broad as well. So we do a lot with the life sciences industry, the pharmaceutical biotech industry. They were the first ones actually to do real world evidence on scale. Back in the 1990s. The FDA is now a pretty big client of ours. NERI brings in a big chunk of NIH funding. That's a lot of our, 70% of their funding actually came from there and from Department of Defense. So we do a lot, healthcare has always done for CDC and for PCORI. And we actually are also doing, as the payers begin to ask for this, we do a bit of work for the payers, especially the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. And there's some pretty specific advantages that the Blues plan, including the Blues plan here in Virginia, which we own, is because of the way their data are structured, they kind of give us some good raw materials to start with to do this type of work. And these are those raw materials. So we have 40 million people in the United States that we actually work with. In fact, our database has about 62 million people where we actually get their data on as they're exposed to the healthcare system. And it's pretty broad in terms of both commercial, Medicare, some Medicaid, very large Medicaid, very large in commercial, and some Medicare. This is an important statistic for us because if you look at the folks at NERI, one of the things they've spent a lot of their time on is working a lot in rare diseases, especially in childhood. And so if we get 1 in 12 births are covered or within our membership, and that's a good starting point for us to do a lot of research in pediatrics as well. This is what I meant by, this is actually why we sold to Anthem and WellPoint back in 2003, and why we've actually stayed a part of this, is because this environment that this gives us, we have the ability to not only use the claims data, but we spend a tremendous amount of our energy working with our patient community, membership within Anthem, to understand their exposure to the healthcare system and what matters to them. So looking at patient-reported outcomes has always been a real key focus for us. The ability to get to other types of data, like chart data that we need to use to marry with our claims data, and also to build those partnerships with those providers to be able to educate them on how to do research and then bring them into the research environment is really key for us. This environment for us is everything. We spent a tremendous amount of our time and a lot of investment in bringing this up, and especially this year, actually. We've doubled down quite a bit, Anthem has, on building out this environment because we understand how important it is. And the timing is good because the world is actually shifting quite a bit in this space, and we know that if we can evolve that environment and learn how to use it pretty quickly in a collaborative fashion with a lot of other groups out there, then we can get through that learning curve as fast as possible. So I'll close with that, and then again, just going back to just as we think about a lot of things we do in the healthcare system, sort of think root cause. And if I think about, the one thing that I may have a strength in, I'm not a heavy, hardcore researcher like the 219 other people in HealthCore, like a lot of the folks in this room, but I'm really good at seeking out root causes of issues, and I work a lot with, and then innovating, thinking how we can innovate and build solutions on top of that, and bringing the smart people, very diverse groups of people together, teams to really solve those issues and build a collaborative environment with the external community to do that. And I think if I had a message for any of you, especially as students, is this is a space ripe for talent. We can't hire folks fast enough. I've got 60 positions open right now. 220 people, I've got 60 spots, 30% increase in our spots right now on top of the acquisition of NERI. So we've got, getting good talent is one of the hardest things to do in this space, and the talent is diverse. It's not only the ones we talked about, but data science is becoming a big part of what we're doing. In fact, I've got a sister part of Anthem that's our healthcare analytics part that we're actually building a co-located facility in Chicago to bring their data science team in with our research team to really figure out how we can cross-fertilize a lot of things that we're doing. But I think it's an exciting time to be where you are and in the process. And if you have any other questions, I'm always happy to answer those either now or offline. So thank you.
So we're going to go through the Q&A part of the presentation.
One of the worries, of course, always is how good is the data? And
Yeah.
one of the things you haven't addressed, and I think is systematically relevant, is financial incentives. For instance, for doctors, very often, which classification you give of what the patient has affects reimbursement, whether there is any, or how large it is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. But every one of these nodes, there are issues of that sort to address, and I think it's systematic.
Yeah, so I don't know if the folks on the webcast can actually hear that, but that, okay, good. But the issue is spot on. So again, it goes back to understanding where there may be weaknesses in the data. Your point is, you're saying is that there's not just a clinical incentive in your data. The actual claims data is meant to pay bills, right? So and it's meant for paying bills. That's the sole purpose of its origination. So doctors they hire organizations to help them optimize that reimbursement. So that means that the types of codes they're putting into this thing actually have to be optimized for that. So they may be so much optimized sometimes it may impact their interpretability. So two things are important in that. Notice when I said the HealthCore integrated research environment, this piece, what I didn't say was the HealthCore integrated research database. Right? So we have a database, but the database exists inside of the environment. And the importance of that environment is two things. One of them is I can swim upstream and look at the systems in this. I can go all the way back to the provider and understand what that may mean. And that's when my chief medical officer within HealthCore he's a veteran of the industry. He's a internist geriatrics was his specialty. He spent many years inside of both the primary care hospital, ultimately was in the payer model, ran the informatics portions of payers. He understands how to trace provenance back on the data. So provenance is a really big issue, and being able to go back and say, well, wait a minute, when our research teams design a study, they almost always go to him and say, here's the question I'm trying to answer. How do I take the data and answer it the right way? And where are the weaknesses in those conclusions I may draw from that? And that's his job. He spends his time really looking hard at that and saying, well, here's the problem. When the physician's coding for this, here's what they're often trying to do. So you have to really be careful in this code. These are not subject to that, but this one may be. So it's really kind of peeling that back apart and really trying to make sure that the interpretation is key. So that's one aspect of being able to swim back upstream, and that's the provenance issue. The other is the ability to enrich, right? So if I've got other types of data that I need, if I'm drawing a key conclusion from my claims data, and we'll often do this, we'll say, well, look, we actually need to go back in and validate or refute what we just found. Let's go find other sources of truth for this. Let's go back to the health record. Now, the health record is subject to its own issues of interpretability that we talked about before, but when you begin to pair them together, you begin to get to solve some of those issues because one is better for other things. So think about what's inside the electronic health record that you can't find. You know what was prescribed in a health record, but you have no idea if they had it filled or how frequently they had it filled. We used to have patients that would come back. Mrs. Jones would give her that drug for hypertension. She'd come back in 3 weeks, blood pressure not well controlled, bump the dose up, bring her back in 3 weeks, not controlled, add another drug on top of that, not controlled, switch her to another. The reality was she wasn't taking it. She never got the first one filled. And that's happened very frequently. And so the claims data does tell us that, because when they went back in to get it filled, it shows up as a claim. And I get that immediately. I can see that. So we begin to pair those together, and we can say, well, the reason it's not working is the patient's not taking it. So as you begin to pull these back together, that has both research and clinical care implications. So the ability to enrich is key. And that went back to that Venn diagram before. Being able to pull them together is key. But then realizing we're down here on the learning curve, to your very point, we're down here on the learning curve. How do we work to make it better? We worked with a group practice one time to pull their data to integrate it in, like I was talking about. And we actually went back to say, well, how usable is the data from the electronic health record? We looked at height and weight data. 50% of it was crap. I mean, you would not believe what went in those fields. And they were defined fields. Height and weight, that's all we needed to do. So it was 50% was unusable. So we went back to the head of the practice and said, look, here's what's going on. And so he went back in and systematically changed how they entered the data in. So it was a collaborative process. They went back in to try to improve the inputs. Now, if a doc knows that the input's now used for something like this, they'll be more thoughtful in what they do. whether it's height, weight, blood pressure, whatever it might be, they're going to be more thoughtful, and it's still going to make errors, but they're going to be less of them. So it's that collaborative model that's key to making that work. It's a terrific question.
Any question? Yes.
Can you speak to using real-world evidence in relation to surrogate models and accelerated approvals that are now more common in the FDA approval process? Because it seems to me like, yes, these drugs are getting out a lot faster, but they're coming with less evidence and less relation to real clinical outcomes. So how do you tackle that challenge, and can we use real-world evidence to supplement that data?
So there's two different ways that their patients are getting drug earlier, right? You're talking about the accelerated approval, and then there's early access, right? Which means your patients can get it before the drug product's on the market under certain circumstances, right? So both of them are subject to the same type of issue in that, but the one you're talking about is really one I was trying to allude to before. We're pushing more and more politically, and for good reason, because patients groups are asking for access to products much sooner. And the consequence is they come out with less evidence on them. And that we've actually talked a bit about this in different circles, including with the FDA. And one of the things that this infrastructure that we're working to create, this environment to be able to collect the data much more readily, is going to be essential for that to happen. So if we even go back to the designs like I mentioned before, this actually would be even more important for a drug that's actually been pushed through the accelerated approval process. What you could do in that case is if you put it on the market, you can actually do it in a preliminary approval, which is not really a term in the United States, but it's one that many have contemplated. You do a sort of a conditional approval, and then you put further evidence, and then you do a final approval, or you actually mandate post-approval research. And put teeth in that mandate. So it makes it much more important for that.
Have companies been good about following up on the post-marketing approval, or is there really low compliance?
Well, it depends. I think under certain circumstances, when the FDA has put certain restriction or requirements on that, then yes. If they're suggesting it, then no. In that case, so that's why I made the comment, put teeth in it. There has to be actually teeth in that model to make it work. I actually think it's a collaborative model between both the regulator and the payer, because if the payer says, I'm not going to pay for it unless this is done, then they're going to do it at that point. And what we call that, and we're exploring it, we got a internal meeting in a couple of weeks with this term called coverage with evidence development. Right? The idea, okay, we'll cover it. We don't think there's enough evidence yet, but let's be a part of generating the evidence. And it's allowed to be covered for those who are inside of that are being studied. Let's cover it, at least under those conditions, until we actually know whether or not it works and in whom it works. And that's sort of the idea of CED. So if you compare the regulator who has regulatory teeth and a payer who has reimbursement teeth on this, put those together, then I think that actually is when you'll get that compliance with it. But it is an issue. It's a pretty big issue. I think it's very insightful questions, both. Yes?
I'm going to play devil's advocate on a couple different things.
Sure.
When I think about accelerated drugs coming to the market.
Yep.
Okay, so let's pretend that you're the drug manufacturer. You have an accelerated drug that hits the market, less experiential evidence that this is going to work. The likelihood of having more lawsuits come about and product loss because of that, does that get factored into the price of the drug, which raises the price of the drug to compensate? Think about violence. If you were to push that to the market even faster, and you have $5 billion in lawsuits for a $2 billion drug.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, I think as a company, you're going to see increasing drug costs as they hit the market faster. It could be a big snowball.
Yeah, and actually, again, it was actually more of a point making versus devil advocate. I really agree with that point. Earlier access could lead to a different price point on it, and that's actually one of the reasons why some groups are not happy about that whole process. Whether it's lawsuits that are driving it or the fact that you really have, you think about what we have less, go back to the payer side of things. We actually have less now evidence to base a decision on that case, yet we're going to be under the same pressure to reimburse for that product. So it's the same type of, actually the issues get worse in that situation rather than better. And it's why some don't advocate for that type of early access or accelerated approval. But think about from the other side. Okay, if you're a cancer patient and you have no options left, and that's the only thing you think would work, well, whether you go through your early access or expanded access program, or whether you go through the product goes through accelerated approval so you can get it sooner, there's sort of always two sides to that, and I don't know that there's a good answer. This begins to answer some of that. And but you have to layer on top of that the systems that can actually look at reimbursement issues as well. Because one of the things that I've heard policymakers complaints the concerns they have with some of these is that the pricing issues, once you've proven something works, you actually lose a lot of leverage on pricing at that point in time because of that.
Well, and another piece of that might be that finally those false negatives will come through and we'll have something that works in an Asian woman that didn't work in a white man.
That's right.
So,
And then you can guide therapy on those. That's the phenotype piece that we're getting to before.
Can I add one more thing about this conditional approval? We had a problem with Avastin in breast cancer. I think it was last year, if I don't remember wrong. There is no any drug for metastatic breast cancer out there, and Avastin is a very good drug for other type of metastatic cancer. And somehow the company managed to have some kind of conditional approval for having this drug tested in metastatic breast cancer. It was a total disaster. All the patients died. I think 497 women died, 3 survived to the treatment, and it was taken out of the market. I think it was sometime late last year. So the conditional approval came as a necessity because there was no drug for metastatic breast cancer. It was $80,000 the dose, and it went through this initial set of tests with 500 women, and it failed. So the risk is extreme for these conditional approval things. I mean, I do understand the need for having things in the market, but
I can't argue.
You know, the balance is right there. It's a very fine line where, that we need to live with to have things approved a little bit earlier, and then find out that we need to withdraw it from the market.
Yep. I agree, totally. It's a very complex, none of these are simple issues.
What about, oh, sorry, go ahead. So who was?
Yes.
I was just wondering if the data generated, could it be used for, so drugs on the market, but it might have applications in other conditions? Could this data help researchers or whatever find those connections?
Yeah, so there's a lot of off-label use that happens, and then we actually see it in our data. We can go because we can see the diagnosis and we can see the drug that was used for that, and we can often determine that in fact they didn't have the use is being used, the product's being used off-label. So there's quite a bit of opportunity with that, and the pharmaceutical industry is a bit handcuffed in that because of what they can and can't do with off-label type claims with the product on the market. But the reality is that there's a lot of opportunity in that. In fact, one of the things that one of the early use cases we're working with the FDA on in this effort is when we start thinking about using real-world evidence in regulatory decision support is actually using it for new indications for products that are already on the market. And I think it's getting along the lines of what you're talking about, whether you're using it, picking up the off-label use and then studying that, or if you have a suspicion that a product may be useful for something different based on early evidence, can we actually use real-world evidence to generate that versus having to go back through the entire RCT process that may in fact be unnecessary. So yes.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Go back to the previous slide. So we're currently changing phase 4. We're proposing changing phase 3. But my sticking point is on phase 1. A lot of target conditions have a completely different set of circumstances going on than a healthy patient. And so how do you
reconcile that?
How do you reconcile that? Because
Not
I have ADHD and my medication does very different things in people who don't have it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so your point about the whether that's safety, which typically that's what's going on in phase 1, right? But so adverse events are going to be different in patients that may have the condition versus those who don't, and that actually sometimes does show up. It doesn't show up until you get to phase 2, even if it's then. And sometimes if it's not, if it's a rare event, it really won't show up until the product comes on the market. In many cases, it's an issue that I don't have a good answer for. I wish well, part of it may be in simulations or models as we begin to understand a lot more about physiology and able to do that in terms of models. And we were talking a little bit about that from the computational modeling side of things. Is if we can the more we understand about the human body, the more we can model those things and say, well, we think this may be different, so that you can actually learn to study it sooner. That could be one way around it, but there's just so little we know right now compared to what we need to know. And I think that if we can find a way to accelerate it, very much like I'm talking about on the back end, if you can do that on the front end as well, then I think you may actually have the true ability to go from molecule to viable product very quickly. So it's a very good point. Wish I had a good answer for you.
Okay, we need to stop here because he has a very tight calendar for today. So thank you very much all for coming. And if anything is needed, if you have any other burning questions, please send it to me. I'll make sure that I pass it to Dr. Moore.
Thanks.
Okay.
Go Hokies.
Okay.
My pleasure.
I think people, they don't get an idea of the